Right now, as you're watching this video, the price of building a home in America just went up again. And if you think that doesn't affect you, think again. Whether you're renting, trying to buy your first home, or just someone trying to do a simple kitchen renovation, what I'm about to explain will hit you directly in the wallet. This isn't some far-off prediction or theory. This is happening right now across every single state in this country. And all of it traces back to one pivotal moment when President Donald Trump stood up and declared, "We don't need Canada's lumber. We have 300 billion trees. We can do this ourselves." Now, I want you to understand something. This claim has backfired in the most spectacular and painful way possible for hardworking American families. You're about to find out exactly what happened, how we got here, and just how much more money is coming out of your pocket because of this. You'll also hear from the people who were supposed to be protected by these tariffs, the ones now shouting that this whole thing needs to stop. So, if you care about the future of housing in this country, if you care about your money or the American dream of owning a home, I need you to do something right now. Smash that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment below to tell me where you're watching from. I want to hear from every corner of this nation about how this is affecting you personally. Now, let's dive into it. In March of 2025, President Trump directed the Commerce Department to initiate a Section 232 investigation into timber and lumber imports. For those of you unfamiliar with Section 232, it's a legal tool that grants the president the power to impose tariffs on imports that are deemed a threat to national security. Yes, national security, keep that in mind because it's going to come into play later. The investigation moved forward under the leadership of Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, and by September 30th, 2025, Trump signed a presidential proclamation. This imposed a 10% tariff on all imported softwood timber and lumber, plus a 25% tariff on kitchen cabinets, bathroom vanities, and upholstered wooden furniture. These tariffs took effect on October 14th, 2025. But hold on, this is where things get even worse. On January 1st, 2026, tariffs on kitchen cabinets shot up to 50%, and upholstered wooden furniture saw a 30% increase. To make matters even more challenging, Canadian softwood lumber was already facing anti-dumping and countervailing duties totaling about 35%. So, when you stack on the new 10% Section 232 tariff, Canadian lumber entering the U.S. now faces duties exceeding 45%. And what was the justification for all of this, the national security argument? The Commerce Department claimed that wood products are vital to the Department of Defense, used in military infrastructure, housing for military personnel, munitions, transportation, missile defense systems, and even nuclear reentry vehicles. Now, no one's going to argue that the military doesn't need wood products. It's an obvious truth. But here's where things get tricky for home builders, economists, and anyone with common sense. The United States doesn't produce enough softwood lumber to meet its own demand. That's not up for debate. It's a fact. The U.S. has 300 billion trees, but that doesn't mean we have the infrastructure to process them into the lumber needed for construction. As of early 2026, U.S. sawmills are operating at just 64% of their potential capacity. And this number has been steadily decreasing since 2017. So despite having an abundance of trees, we don't have the mills, the workforce, or the supply chain to replace Canadian lumber on demand. That's the crux of the issue. Now, let me tell you who is really getting crushed by this, and it's not who you might think. It's not Canada, though. They are certainly hurting too, but the real victims are American families, home buyers, home builders, and renters. The National Association of Home Builders, which represents the people actually building homes in this country, has stated that tariffs have already added about $9,200 to the cost of a new single-family home. But that's not all. The Center for American Progress published an analysis in December 2025, and their findings were even more alarming. They estimated that tariff-related costs have added $17,500 to every new home being built in America. NBC News did their own independent analysis where they modeled the costs for an 18,800 square foot single-family home, considering every single construction material, and they found that tariffs added at least $4,400 to the materials cost alone. And the experts who reviewed this analysis considered it conservative because it didn't even include labor costs. But here's where things get even more concerning. According to the Center for American Progress, these higher building costs, driven by tariffs, will result in 450,000 fewer homes being built over the next 5 years from now until 2030. That's 450,000 homes that will not exist in a country that already has a housing shortage in the millions. The Brookings Institution calculated that current tariffs will add roughly $30 billion to the costs of investing in residential structures, with 90% of that increase falling on the construction of new homes and apartments. This is real. This is happening, and it's making the housing crisis in America dramatically worse. And here's the kicker. It's almost ironic. On January 20th, 2025, President Trump signed an executive order aiming to lower housing costs and increase housing supply. That was the stated goal. But the tariff policy that followed did the exact opposite. The National Association of Home Builders chairman Carl Harris could not have been clearer. He said that the increase in tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods would have the opposite effect of the president's own housing goals. More than 70% of the imports that home builders rely on softwood lumber and gypsum for drywall come from Canada and Mexico. And these tariffs not only increase construction costs, but also discourage new development. Ultimately, it's American consumers who pay the price in the form of higher home prices. Now let's fast forward to February 20th, 2026. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, does not authorize tariffs, which struck down part of the broader tariff structure. However, the Section 232 tariffs on lumber, imposed under a different legal authority, remain in effect. The Tax Foundation, which has been tracking these developments meticulously, now estimates that these tariffs are effectively increasing taxes for every U.S. household by around $1,500 in 2026. And that's on top of everything else Americans are already paying. Record high home prices, mortgage rates that make it nearly impossible for first-time buyers to enter the market. Let's bring this into the real world. A building materials supplier in Farmingdale, New York, named J.C. Ryan, had a contract to supply wooden doors and frames for an apartment complex in Nassau County. They were getting the materials from a Canadian supplier because it was cheaper than the U.S. equivalent. Half of the job was already delivered, but once the tariffs hit, the remaining $75,000 worth of materials saw an additional $19,000 in costs. After the supplier added their markup, the customer ended up owing $30,000 more than originally planned $30,000 on a single contract for wooden doors. Or consider Bar Zakim, a contractor in San Diego who owns Better Place Design and Build, specializing in accessible dwelling units. Zakim said that Canada remains the best source for lumber, but sticking with imported wood meant he had to raise his prices by 15% compared to a year ago. He said, "I'm not about to go out of business, but it's looking to be a slow, expensive year for us." These are real people, real businesses, real Americans getting squeezed by these policies. The Federal Reserve's Beige Book, which tracks economic conditions across the country, specifically mentioned concerns from construction contacts about rising lumber prices. 4 of the 12 regional Fed banks, Richmond Street, and the 12 Louis, Kansas City, and San Francisco referenced worries about higher building material costs. Construction activity has slowed down, and builders are now including escalation clauses in their contracts because they can't predict what materials will cost from week to week. Lenders, too, are becoming more cautious in their underwriting due to the risks posed by fluctuating material costs. But here's the part that no one is talking about. The real victims aren't the wealthy developers or big corporations. They have long-term supply contracts that shield them from price shocks, at least for a while. The real pain is being felt by the smallest contractors, the local builders, and the family-owned construction companies. These builders, the ones constructing just a handful of homes each year in your community, are the ones bearing the brunt of these tariff increases. The national home builders like Toll Brothers and D.R. Horton are insulated because of their ability to lock in long-term contracts with suppliers. They're still feeling the impact of the rising material costs, but they have more flexibility. On the other hand, the small builder who buys materials at current market prices has no such cushion. So when those prices spike because of tariffs, they have to make a difficult choice. They either absorb the cost, which they can't afford to do, or they pass the increased cost onto the buyer, which makes homes less affordable for average Americans. The alternative? They simply stop building. And that's exactly what's happening. Single-family home construction starts in April 2025 were down 12% compared to April 2024. Builders are pulling back because the math no longer works. The financial pressures are too high. And here's where I need to address the elephant in the room, the argument that we should just use American lumber. Look, I'm all for supporting domestic production. I'm all for American manufacturing. I'm all for creating jobs right here at home. But here's the reality. You can't simply wish an industrial capacity into existence. The United States imports about 1/3 of the lumber it consumes because we don't produce enough to meet our own demand. Canada, in particular, accounts for nearly 85% of all U.S. softwood lumber imports. That's not a small dependency. It's a structural reality of the North American lumber market, built over decades. Yes, President Trump signed an executive order to ramp up domestic logging, but experts have said that it will take years for the U.S. to produce enough timber to replace what we get from Canada. You can't just cut down trees and expect to have lumber overnight. You need sawmills, trained workers to operate those mills, transportation infrastructure, drying facilities, the whole supply chain. Right now, as I mentioned earlier, American sawmills are running at just 64% of their potential capacity, and that number has been on a decline since 2017. So while we wait for this dream of ramping up domestic production to materialize, American families are the ones paying the price every single day. They're paying more for homes, more for renovations, and more for the materials that make their homes livable. But let's take a step back for a moment and look at how Canada is responding to all of this. Prime Minister Mark Carney has announced a major support package for the Canadian lumber and steel industries. Canada is committing $700 million in loan guarantees and an additional $500 million in long-term support to help Canadian lumber companies diversify their export markets. Carney was very direct about the situation. He acknowledged that the decades-long process of building a closer economic relationship with the United States is now over. He pointed out that 90% of Canada's lumber exports, 90% of their aluminum exports, and 90% of their steel exports were all headed to one market, the United States. But now, those strengths have turned into vulnerabilities. In response, Canada is actively working to find new buyers for their lumber. They're cutting freight rates for transporting lumber within their own country by 50%, and they're building new trade relationships. But here's the real kicker for America. If Canada successfully diversifies its lumber exports away from the United States and starts finding reliable buyers in Asia, Europe, or the Middle East, we could face a severe problem in the future. When we need Canadian lumber again, and we will need it, the supply might not be there. The trade relationships may no longer exist, and the favorable pricing that we once enjoyed could be a thing of the past. This could lead to a permanent structural shift in the North American lumber market that leaves the U.S. in a far worse position than when all of this started. Imagine, down the road, when the demand for lumber spikes again and we're unable to rely on Canada to meet that demand. The long-term consequences could be devastating for the U.S. construction industry and, by extension, the entire housing market. Now, let's zoom out and look at what this all means for the broader U.S. economy. The Tax Foundation has called the Trump tariffs the largest tax increase as a percentage of GDP since 1993. According to Yale's Budget Lab, the overall output of the construction sector could fall by 4.1% over the next 3 years due to these tariffs. And the housing shortage in America? It's real. It's severe. Multiple estimates put the gap in the number of homes anywhere from 3.7 million to 7 million units, depending on how you count it. And now, we're actively making that shortage worse by making it more expensive to build new homes. So here's the question. Does this make sense? Does it make sense to claim that we want to lower housing costs on day one of the presidency, only to impose tariffs that, according to the National Association of Home Builders, the Brookings Institution, the Center for American Progress, Yale's Budget Lab, and every major housing economist in the country, will raise housing costs and reduce the number of homes being built? I don't think it does. And this isn't just a partisan issue. Housing affordability affects everyone. It doesn't matter if you voted red or blue. When your rent goes up by $200 a month because there aren't enough homes being built, that's money coming out of your pocket, regardless of your politics. When the dream of homeownership keeps moving further out of reach for young Americans, that's a failure that goes beyond party lines. Let's be honest about this. Housing costs are skyrocketing, and tariffs are one of the main reasons why. We need to talk about it, and we need to act fast. But before we dive deeper into how we got here, let's look at what you can do. Stay with me as we explore how these tariffs affect everyday Americans and how the housing market is being shaped by these decisions. Don't go anywhere.